In conclusion, it is important to grasp or come to terms with that each of taxation and appropriation, chains of responsibility and accountability, and performance accounting all have very similar themes. For example, there is an element of trust and confidence that is present within each of those topics, and that ultimately translates into accountability, and that translates to chains of responsibility that are set up to manage accountability, and financial performance which backs up that accountability, and later on the result which occurs that later on leads to the drafting of the budget. Now moving on to the topic that I selected, which is modern bureaucracy. Just from my studies and from my research and reading of the articles available on Learn and online, what really interested me was the managerialist phase, which took place in the 1980s. During this time, there was a lot of major reforms happening, not just in the managerial sense, but also in the taxation discipline, for instance. So I think I've read somewhere that tax levied on personal income was in the 66% or 60%, and I was just absolutely shocked because this was brand new knowledge to me, and the fact that it was changed from being in the in the 60s to the 30s, and it wasn't integrated slowly. It wasn't like 60% goes to 50, 40, and 30. It was just 60 to 30 or 33, and it was amazing. More that I'd like to know about modern bureaucracy includes practical applications and examples from an accounting jurisdiction, from an accountancy point of view. For example, our outcomes translated in the accounting sense to be the ethical code that we have to adhere to, because it does seem like objectives that we would succumb to as accountants to deliver an absolutely brilliant result, which encompasses general principles, due diligence, due care, confidence, professional behavior, and so on. Would this be regarded as outcomes? And with regards to the outputs, what is outputs in an accounting sense? Is it the amount of returns that you file if you're under a company, an accounting company, or how does that really work? That's something I'm unsure of, and I wasn't able to locate the information for that online. I've chosen this aspect as my matter of interest due to the relevance and applicability of it to real life. It prompts creative solutions to dilemmas that we are faced with, an approach that we'd have to be familiar with when we become accountants in the future. It encompasses in one way or another all three other topics previously discussed, chiefly performance perhaps, but also has fragrant undertones of chains of responsibility, accountability, and budgetary practice. Modern bureaucracy emerged from the 1980s, and this managerialist phase between the 1978 and 1985 years was spoken about earlier, which involved basically introducing private sector management techniques and accrual accounting into public sector organizations. I couldn't but help wonder what sort of socio-political effect this dynamic phase had on those involved or affected by government's actions, what it would be like to live and thrive among the society of the 1980s. Since the introduction of reforms in New Zealand, there's been a want to discharge holistic accountability. In a case study revolving about the primary health organizations, it has surfaced that a major impediment in securing holistic accountability is the failure of the new strategy to define clearly how the funder and provider should share accountability for improving their community's health. Norman 2007 found that accountability was not to be understood on its own, but its importance of trust and power is extremely influential in construing both perceptions of accountability and budgetary practice. By setting a budget, it creates a strategy and standard to abide by. This therefore shows power and creates trust from people that management is trying to do the right thing and are being accountable to those around them. After 15 years of focusing on outputs, New Zealand government's performance management system now expects public servants to manage for outcomes while continuing to be accountable for outputs. This is a result of outputs becoming narrowly focused on the easily measurable and doable, and the new system potentially offers a way of combining bottom-line accountability with the motivating power of less measurable outcomes. This shift from centralized regulation to decentralized management was the defining event in New Zealand public sector reform. Deregulation of the public service compelled managers to move from a passive compliance mentality to an active management mentality. Modern bureaucracy takes radical steps to revolutionize this. Modern bureaucracy seeks to break up a process-bound bureaucracy. New Zealand public management reformers in the 1980s relied strongly on outputs and contracting to instill a new focus on results. As a technique for distributing deep-seated organizational routines, funding for outputs has proved a powerful method of fiscal control and managerial accountability. The current challenge in New Zealand is to define public value by reconciling two necessary but potentially conflicting features of a controlled system. Outputs versus outcomes. Can they be combined? On one hand, some say that modern bureaucracy involves putting together conflicting terms. Input divulges scientific accountability, exact numbers and results. Meanwhile, outcomes are more subjective and almost sound like a wish list of things to work towards. On the other hand, the current effort to reconcile output-based accountability with the broader picture provided by outcomes is less a sign of failure rather than an effort to reconcile tensions inherent in performance and control systems. The current challenge of New Zealand performance system is to reconcile the dilemma created by contrasting values of outputs and outcomes. In an excerpt from a 2003 Norman and Gregory article, says that under New Zealand's radical state sector reforms, empowered managers are held accountable in an arm's length way by politicians and control agencies through the use of clearly stated objectives and the availability of quality information about progress towards the objectives. So in that very example, there is an implication towards, we want results, we want outputs, but then again, there is a comprehensive knowledge towards what the objectives are, what you are ultimately aiming towards. However, empirical research indicates that this thermostatic metaphor embodies a number of paradoxes. A great deal of international attention has been paid to these reforms, but New Zealand has not discovered any ultimate resolution of the fundamental paradox of modern bureaucracy, the tendency for control to subvert purpose, and is now seeking a new balance between these two managerial imperatives. Simmons in 1995 presented performance management as a craft of balancing yin-yang elements. The dark yin represents the action, the actual outputs, and the lightness of the yang symbolizes the motivating power of self-driven initiative, similar to that of outcomes. There are strengths and weaknesses of outputs and outcomes. There are strengths and weaknesses attached to outputs and outcomes, all the same. Strengths of outputs include clear, measurable statements of results. It is defined by quality, quantity, and timeliness indicators. They can be clearly linked on the ability of a particular organization and chief executive to achieve and provide a no excuses approach for accountability for results rather than inputs. And some strengths of outcomes includes purpose-orientated descriptions of results with the take a broad and long-term perspective. They're potentially inspirational and motivational and sufficiently broad in as to incorporate contributions from a number of organizations. Having said that, there are weaknesses attached with both outputs and outcomes. A few weaknesses in outputs include that the focus on measurement can shift towards that which can be measured and easily audited. The output can become the goal in the process of goal displacement at the expense of a longer term and more meaningful achievement. Likewise, for outcomes, there are weaknesses which include outcomes becoming so broad that they mean all things to all people, with the achievement becoming very difficult, if not impossible, to measure. Outcome statements can become window dressing that prevent outsiders from assessing how well an organization is doing. So it's almost something that organizations can hide behind. In reality, within the public sector performance system, both outcomes and outputs can provide useful and important definitions of public value, and overemphasis on either or can produce dysfunctional results. So to conclude this section, it is apparent that the government has a major role to play in fixing the economy. This learning had broadened my knowledge in that I now better appreciate how the areas of accountability, taxation, and financial performance all interlink and amalgamate to a whole, as you couldn't explain one concept without using another to back it up. A better understanding for the ideological nature of the arena accountants and other workers are working within. It is clear that the economy and overall well-being in the country would be relevant as part of thriving as an accountant. This is one application that could become very practical in the future. Overall, it does look like New Zealand is taking some bold steps. Nothing is forever from what I've learned about the executive. The fact that it was dynamic, changing, and needing frequent vision. New Zealand's overall economic performance has improved significantly. However, it is hard to pinpoint a link between public sector reforms and improvements in the economy. The challenge really is to match improvements in financial information with improvements in reporting social outcomes. The focus on outputs places too much emphasis on managerial accountability rather than accountability to, the public or the parliament at large. While the physical contours of New Zealand's public sector have been fundamentally altered, many of the same tensions still remain. Boston et al. Points out that bureaucratic reorganizations, however grand, rarely resolve such conflict. Although new balances may be struck, they are unlikely to provide enduring results. A particular institutional or managerial reform may resolve a long-standing tension, but in doing so it is likely that it would create or expose another. In my opinion, and to the extent of my knowledge at this point, the same can be said for any reform. We will always default to cynical predictions, as every plan will realistically have a flaw or some sort of risk attached. In the end, it will be decided community by community, and as long as it's a plan encompassing enhanced transparency by separating powers and making chains of responsibility, distancing politicians from day-to-day administration and management of governmental activities, enhanced performance specification and monitoring, and devolution of activities towards local government, then the plan will likely exert triumph.